It took Ronald Reagan's election to resurrect the CIA. When Reagan named his campaign manager, William Casey, to lead the agency, it ushered in a new era of CIA activism. Like many of the old boys, Casey came out of Wall Street and had been an officer in the OSS. Like his boss, he was an avid cold warrior, a welcome lifesaver to a drowning brotherhood. Together, Reagan and Casey revived America's war against communism. They launched their first attack in Central America.
If we do nothing, if we continue to provide too little help, our choice will be a communist Central America, with additional communist military bases on the mainland of this hemisphere and communist subversion spreading southward and northward.
The president backed his words with money and manpower. Hundreds of CIA officers were hired. The company was back in business.
Went up and saw Casey, and Casey, said hello, and we talked, and he said, and we talked about the Central American thing. It was the issue of the day. And he said, look, he said, take, as he often did, he said, take off a couple of months, or take a couple of months and study this problem, and then come back to me with a recommendation on what we ought to do in Central America.
The number one target was Nicaragua. In 1979, the Sandinista revolution, backed by Castro and the Soviets, had toppled dictator Anastasio Somoza and brought a socialist government to Central America. Reagan convinced Congress to fund a very limited CIA operation to prevent the Sandinista revolution from spreading. Then he turned to his secret warriors.
Believe me, it didn't take rocket science, and it didn't take 2 months to figure out what ought to be done down there, okay? We should take the war to Nicaragua, and we should start killing Cubans. Because if you start making life difficult for the Cubans in Nicaragua, maybe they'll go home. Well, of course, this was exactly what Casey wanted to hear.
In 1981, only a small band of anti-Sandinista guerrillas existed. Then Dewey Clarridge came in with weapons and money to create the force known as the Contras.
You gotta understand, for Reagan, the Contras were his boys. I mean his boys. There's no way he was ever gonna let them down. Remember one time after an NSPG meeting, he said, you think you can get your vandals to attack that airport down there when they bring the MiGs in? And I said, Mr. President, I don't think my vandals or your vandals have quite got the wherewithal to get down into the planes and attack that airport.
With Reagan's unwavering support, the CIA operation grew beyond the mission Congress had originally approved. The Contras came out of the mountains to attack small towns and ports.
I'd gone in and shot up the port of Corinto to take out the crane, lit the whole town on fire by hitting all the oil tanks, but nothing was really happening in a real sense.
Casey wanted Clarridge to pull off something big to destabilize the Sandinistas.
So I was sitting there, and I was drinking some martinis. It was late in night. I know I was drinking gin on the rocks, and smoking a cigar, of course. And, it suddenly came to me that mines was the way to go.
Mining Nicaragua's harbors may have seemed like a good idea to Clarridge and Casey, but when news reports uncovered the CIA's role, Americans began to question funding a war against civilians. To the public, Reagan's freedom fighters were looking more like terrorists. In 1984, Congress outlawed all aid to the Contras, and Dewey Clarridge was reassigned. But Casey had other ideas.
The director was interested in the ability to go to an existing, as he put it, off-the-shelf, self-sustaining, stand-alone entity that could perform certain activities on behalf of the United States.
Casey recruited White House aide Oliver North to head up a secret enterprise outside the agency to sell arms to Iran and send the cash to the Contras. Both were illegal. Casey had put the CIA in the middle of another major scandal. Dewey Clarridge was one of several CIA officers, subsequently indicted for lying to Congress to protect Reagan and Casey.
We were all pawns, many of us, in this fight between the executive and the Congress. In the course of all of this, the President of the United States and many others knew exactly what was going on.
In his 5 years on the job, Casey had revived the agency, but his Latin American operations left its reputation as tarnished as when he started.
In many respects, he was the best director that we had during my 30 years with CIA, and sadly will be in some ways the worst.
He was probably the leader of the agency that most loved it, or most loved my side of it. But all that said, I'd have to say he was a net loss.
A brain tumor killed William Casey before he was called to account for the worst CIA crisis in a decade, and before he could stake his claim to what may have been the CIA's greatest victory, the defeat of the Soviet Army in Afghanistan. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the Cold War heated up. William Casey assigned 2 veteran CIA officers, Milt Bearden and Frank Anderson, to supply and train the outmatched Afghan guerrillas, known as the Mujahideen.
I, like everybody else, believed that ragtag bunches of third world insurgents don't defeat the Red Army.
Bearden and Anderson put together an exotic coalition of Polish, Egyptian, and Chinese arms dealers to equip the fiercely independent Afghan guerrillas.
I told them, look guys, don't do car bombs, don't do truck bombs, there's no percentages in it, let's don't do that. So they would load a camel up with 150 pounds of Semtex, plastic explosives, and tie it up against a building in this town in eastern Afghanistan, which is kind of like the USO and officers' canteen of the Soviet Army. And when they're all in there sitting around drinking their vodkas and watching whatever they're watching, rip that baby off and blow up 150 pounds of Semtex and a camel and the Soviet Officers Club. And they were very proud to get back to me and said, see, Mr. Milt, we did a camel bomb. We didn't do a truck bomb.
What eventually brought down the Soviets was the U.S.-made Stinger missile. Inside the agency, they debated the future dangers of giving Islamic fundamentalists such a lethal weapon. But Casey's priority was beating the communists, and he prevailed.
A flight of Soviet attack helicopters was moving from Kabul down to this airfield. They stood up, ripped off the first Stinger of the great Afghan war, and it just flew like a great white dart across this blue sky and popped that first helicopter. Second gunner loaded up, and they stood there kind of like a buffalo stand for about another full minute and knocked out 3 of these guys. Pow, pow, pow.
The helicopter-killing Stinger turned the tide in the CIA's last battle of the Cold War. After suffering more than 13,000 combat deaths and a decade of severe economic strain, the Soviets abandoned the war against the Mujahideen. Bearden remembers the day when the last Soviet troops crossed the bridge to leave Afghanistan.
That night, I went home to Pakistan. You could see my office from the office of the KGB resident in Pakistan, and he had asked me on the circuit a number of times. He said, Mr. Bearden, you must be working very hard all the time because I'm always seeing the light on in your office. And so I kept it on for 3 years just to kind of jerk this big potato-headed KGB general around, and then on the night of 15th February 1989, turn the light off.
The CIA's secret warriors had long dreamt of helping to defeat the Red Army. When Milt Bearden sent the news back to Langley, they broke out the champagne.